Why are there hundreds of American wars that started without a declaration? How much power does the US president have in waging a military operation outside the country? Well, we've studied hundreds of pages of reports released by Congressional Research Service in America. And here are the answers. Welcome to Facts Tell. I'm Sina. Before we get into that, let me walk you through some of the history. In the summer of 1787, a group of brilliant minds, in fact, 55 in total, gathered in Philadelphia and attended a constitutional convention, which was presided over by George Washington. They drafted a new constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation, and that's why they're later called the framers of the Constitution, who created a framework for government that has survived more than 200 years. What exactly was this framework? The government was divided into three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. The legislative branch consists of Congress, the executive branch consists of the president, and the judicial branch consists of the United States Supreme Court. In other words, the whole system was designed to protect people's rights and make sure the checks and balance system was in place. As the framers saw, the decision to commit the U.S. to an armed conflict was too big to be left to either side alone. War powers are shared between the legislative and executive organs. The U.S. Constitution empowers Congress to declare wars, authorize hostilities at any level, and fund them, while the president has the power to wage wars as commander-in-chief. That's why we've seen the dominant position of war power dangling between Congress and the president. Two branches all trying to get hold of it. And the balance of authority in initiating war has changed over time. One of the reports issued by the Congressional Research Service reviews hundreds of instances in which the U.S. has initiated military forces abroad. Between 1798 to 2022, the U.S. conducted more than 450 military operations. South Korea, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Libya, Chad, Persian Gulf, Kuwait, Bosnia, Yugoslavia, East Timor, Kosovo, Afghanistan. You name it. The list goes on and on. You can see American troops were fighting all over the world, and these are only the ones on the record, among which only 11 separate cases where the U.S. formally declared a war against foreign nations. Most of these 11 cases happened before or during World War II, such as the war with Great Britain, the war with Mexico, the war with Spain, the First World War, and the Second World War. Yet the ones that brought trauma and death to millions of people in recent years went undeclared, including the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Persian Gulf War, the war with Iraq from 2003 to 2011, the war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021. And in countless cases, we saw military officers act without any authorization from Congress, where actions were conducted solely under the president's powers as commander-in-chief. But we're talking about something serious, right? Armed forces, mass destructions, people becoming homeless, and in most cases, innocent people's deaths. Should the process be a big decision for every politician in the country, if not for all the citizens? Especially when most of the American wars were fought thousands of miles away from its borders. They were not even the ones that America essentially had to fight. Should we see politicians on all sides fiercely debating about it, shouting out their views, and then struggling to reach a consensus, just like how they've tried to pass a budget? But you hardly heard any such news, right? Why is that? And since when the checks and balance system has malfunctioned in the federal government, and the U.S. presidents began to tightly grasp the war powers? According to Council on Foreign Relations in America, presidents have demonstrated greater power to wage wars since the end of Second World War. So here we go. Even if we're talking about wars and protracted military conflicts, U.S. presidents can still ignore Congress. In all honesty, it just starts sounding non-democratic to me. And when we can skip the checks and balance part of war powers, it's doomed that tragedies will happen. By the 1970s, many lawmakers had grown wary of presidents deploying the armed forces abroad without consulting Congress. Then U.S. President Harry Truman committed U.S. troops to the Korean War. Then U.S. Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon had overseen the long and controversial conflict during the Vietnam War. Of course, all these wars went undeclared, yet over 36,000 U.S. military got killed in the Korean War, and over 58,000 military fatal casualties were recorded in the Vietnam War. What about civilians? In 1995, Vietnam released its official estimate of the number of people killed during the fight, as many as 2 million civilians on both sides. Shocking numbers, but that's not all. What about a secret bombing conducted under the Nixon administration? In 1970, a total of 3,630 American flights dropped more than 100,000 tons of bombs over the sky in Cambodia. And this operation lasted for 4 years from 1969. Nothing came from Congress, not even a note. Yet, it's estimated that 100,000 Cambodians lost their lives due to this relentless military operation. I mean, it confused me. Are these guys presidents of the United States or just war criminals? Of course, people sitting in Congress were also disturbed by revelations about the Vietnam War and such. So legislative efforts to rein in presidential war powers collapsed during the Nixon time. The House and Senate crafted the War Powers Resolution, which was enacted in 1973, even over an executive veto by President Richard Nixon. The resolution frames it as a means of guarantee that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President will apply whenever the American armed forces are deployed overseas. To that end, it required U.S. President to consult with the legislature in every possible instance before committing troops to war, and needed to notify Congress within 48 hours of using armed forces. Additionally, the law forbids armed forces from remaining for more than 60 days unless Congress provides a declaration of war or authorization for the operation to continue. However, even if Congress opposed them and the law was still restricting them, American presidents have found multiple excuses to just go around it and go ahead with their wars. Excuse number 1, NATO. The issue of war powers was raised again in the late 20th century when conflict started in the former territory of Yugoslavia, particularly in Bosnia. The U.S. participated without a congressional authorization in airlifts into Sarajevo, naval monitoring of sanctions, aerial enforcement of a no-fly zone, and safe havens. In late 1995, President Clinton sent more than 20,000 American combat troops in Bosnia as part of a NATO-led peacekeeping force. Because some of the U.S. action had been taken within a NATO framework, action in Bosnia has raised the broader issue of whether action under NATO is exempt from the requirements of the War Powers Resolution or the standard for the exercise of war powers under the Constitution. And there's even more. The issue of presidential war powers again drew significant attention in 1999 when U.S. President Clinton ordered U.S. military forces to participate in a NATO-led military operation in Kosovo. For 78 days, NATO aircrafts bombed Serbian military and civilian targets, killing some 500 people. Excuse number 2, national security. The 9/11 attacks triggered President George W. Bush's war on terror. He is also particularly in favor of referring to the 1973 resolution. Every time he reported to Congress regarding military deployment, he'd like to start with consistent with the War Powers Resolution. But saying this intro didn't mean he had consulted with Congress. In 2001, he initiated combat action in Afghanistan. In 2003, President Bush also started the invasion of Iraq. When reporting to Congress, he said, it was impossible to know how long this operation would take in Iraq. So I guess this was a blatantly defined 60-day rule embedded in the War Powers Resolution. It confused me how many civilians' lives have to be taken and homes have to be destroyed to serve America's so-called war on terror. But for wars that lasted decades, I'm sure there is abandoned terror brought on local people. There were also other reasons apart from taking part in NATO or national security to initial bombings. President Trump ordered strikes on Syria because of suspected chemical weapons. I bet the current situation wasn't something the founding fathers of the United States wanted to see at the beginning. So many bloodsheds, so many fatalities. But this is undoubtedly the result of the systematic failure of the checks and balance system of war power. People like Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Franklin crafted the Constitution to protect people's rights rather than taking those from other nationals. They placed the system of checks and balance so that no one branch of the government could monopolize the power of war, which led to tyranny. But right now, we're not seeing a more peaceful world, if not getting worse. Although under Biden's administration, there was no new invasion. But fanning the flames in Ukraine through NATO and inevitably causing Russia-Ukraine conflict has triggered a humanitarian crisis we're all now facing. It is exactly how the United States secretly got involved in so many wars, giving one excuse after another. And presidents fill the war power vacuum with military action at their discretion. Influenced by American foreign policy, election campaigns, partisan politics, and interest groups, these U.S. presidents became the chief legislator and sole enforcers in the field of war. And the one thing we know for now, America's wars won't end anytime soon. That's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you like our shows, remember to subscribe and like. I'm Saina. I'll see you guys next time.